So in this module, I'm going to talk about the third step in any surrogacy journey. So the first step was creating the embryos, which is done by the intended parents. Step 2 is finding a surrogate, which may be completed by either the intended parent or surrogate. And now we're in step 3. So the intended parents have identified a surrogate and they're ready to move forward. So the next step, step 3, involves medical and psychological clearance for the surrogate. So on this slide, I'm going to go over the basic medical requirements for a potential surrogate. Now, I want to reiterate, and I'll talk about this again, that it's very important that any intended parent consult with their fertility clinic on what their specific requirements are. There is variation among fertility clinics on what they require. One fertility clinic might deny a surrogate, and another fertility clinic might accept that same surrogate. So again, it's very important to ask what your fertility clinic's requirements are. However, in general, surrogate candidates should 1. Be between the ages of 21 and 42. Women that are between 21 and 42 are generally in their reproductive years, which would help improve the odds of a successful pregnancy. The surrogate should have carried at least one child without any complications, so they have demonstrated that they have gone through pregnancy successfully. They should have no more than 3 deliveries via C-section. So if you start having too many C-sections, that might introduce some additional problems in any future pregnancies. So this is why there's a limitation on this. They should have a body mass index less than 33, and some fertility clinics require even less than 33. They should not smoke or abuse alcohol or drugs. And this includes prescription medication for depression. I'll talk about that a little bit later. They should not be receiving welfare, public housing, or any cash assistance from the government. So the reason for this criteria is because in the surrogacy industry, we want to avoid women who are desperate for money because we don't want them to make decisions about their body that are driven by money. And so if you make this condition that women should be financially stable, then they're less likely to enter into a surrogacy journey just because they need the money. Any potential surrogate should have a stable home life with emotional and childcare support. So in case something comes up in the pregnancy and the surrogate needs to be on bed rest, does she have someone or some ones to help her at the house? A surrogate candidate should not have any mental health conditions or be taking any antidepressant medication for the last 6 months. And finally, the surrogate should not have a criminal record. So these are the basic requirements of any surrogate. And before moving on to medical clearance, if you are working with an agency, the agency should have checked these requirements before you even met with the surrogate. And if you're doing an independent journey, it's very important that you ask these questions in case you don't even have a fertility clinic. These are the average requirements that any clinic would ask. So once you know that your surrogate basically has checked the box on all of these requirements, you can move forward in scheduling a medical clearance with your fertility clinic. Now, with medical clearance is required before any embryo transfer can be scheduled. And there's generally 2 steps to a medical clearance. First, your fertility clinic will receive your surrogate's medical paperwork from the past and review them and make an initial assessment. So this will be step 1. And then if the surrogate passes that initial screening, all done on paperwork, nobody has to go in. Just the documents have to be faxed from your surrogate's medical office to the fertility clinics. Once she's passed that, then we can schedule step 2, where the surrogate goes in for an in-person medical examination. So step 1, where the fertility clinic just reviews the past paperwork, is just to make sure that those basic requirements that I talked about in the previous slides have been met. And again, if you're going through an agency, they should have already done that. Most agencies will actually take a step beyond that and have reviewed the medical documents themselves to ensure that the surrogate has met all the requirements. So step 2 of the medical clearance, the in-person medical examination, involves the following things. First, they're going to verify that the surrogate still meets the requirements. For example, is their BMI still less than 33? They're going to do a complete infectious blood panel on both the surrogate and her significant other if she has one. They're going to do a physical exam, and they're going to evaluate her uterus. And so the final clearance actually takes about 2 weeks because they need to send the blood panel out, and getting those results on average takes about 2 weeks. And so if you're thinking about, well, how many surrogates pass the initial screening and then get here and fail, on average, most surrogates will pass this medical examination, but some things do occasionally come up, like high blood pressure, or there could be a benign polyp in the uterus. And unfortunately, before moving forward, those two issues need to be resolved, or any other issue that might come up need to be resolved before you can move forward to an embryo transfer. But usually, most of the time, these issues only delay the journey. They don't prevent the surrogate from being a surrogate at all. And again, some fertility clinics are stricter than others. So it's very important that you check in with your fertility clinic as early as possible in your journey to see what they require in their surrogates. And in addition to a medical examination, a surrogacy journey also involves psychological evaluations, almost always with a surrogate, and then most of the time with an intended parent as well. Many fertility clinics require both surrogates and intended parents to go through a psychological evaluation. So for surrogates, the reasoning is because the evaluation helps ensure that the surrogate is a good fit for a journey and for the intended parents as well. So not all psychological evaluations look the same, but here are some things that might happen. So one thing a surrogate might be asked to do is to take a personality assessment inventory, which is just a personality test that assesses the surrogate's personality and psychopathology. Oftentimes there's a clinical interview, so these are going to be a series of questions about the surrogate and how she plans on pursuing certain aspects of the surrogacy journey. So what is her support system? Why is she pursuing surrogacy? So a lot of the answers to these questions will also feed back to the initial requirements of a surrogate. Do they have an emotional support system? Are they financially stable? So these questions are just to make sure that those requirements are met. A lot of times the surrogate's significant other will also be asked to be included in the interview, and there will be a psychologist to assess and speak to the significant other and the surrogate. And a lot of times there's also a home visit. So if you're going through an agency, a lot of the times an agency will have already covered these questions or these assessments. However, that is not always true. Many agencies do not do this step. So this is an important question to ask if you are interviewing agencies. I will talk about this in more detail in my chapter devoted to evaluating agencies. The psychological evaluation for intended parents is generally much less intense and sometimes not even required. So intended parents are generally evaluated on general mental health wellness. How do they feel about losing control over the pregnancy? So mental health professional will discuss with the intended parent or parents how to cope with the loss of control and how to communicate best with the surrogate and how to develop trust in the surrogate. But many times this is not even done for intended parents. Again, these evaluations are generally driven by the requirements of your fertility clinic. So it's very important that you talk to them if you're an intended parent on what needs to be done.